Joseph Crow Feather's weathered hands trembled as he counted the same 3 copper pennies for the 4th time, knowing they weren't enough for medicine. Baby Thomas's fevered cries echoed through the 2-room cabin like accusations against the Montana night. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made his blood freeze. Little Wolf and Sky stirred restlessly on their shared mattress, hunger gnawing at their small bodies, even in sleep. Joe reached for his rifle with shaking fingers, expecting Sheriff Morrison or the bank collectors who'd been circling like vultures for weeks. Instead, a woman's silhouette appeared against the moonlight, her horse snorting clouds of vapor in the October cold. "Help!" she called softly, dismounting with practiced grace. I heard crying. She carried something wrapped in cloth, a loaf of bread that filled the air with impossible warmth and hope. Joe's grip loosened on his weapon as Sarah's wedding ring hanging from a chain around his neck caught the lamplight through the window. Who was this stranger? And why did salvation always come when you'd given up expecting it? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, when the last wildflowers of spring still dotted the Montana grasslands, Joseph Crow Feather had been a different man. The small settlement of Reservation Creek nestled uneasily between the Cherokee Reservation lands and the white township of Cedar Falls, a place where mixed families like his existed in the uncomfortable spaces between 2 worlds that rarely welcomed them fully. The cabin Joe called home sat on 40 acres of stubborn land that fought against every attempt at cultivation. 2 rooms, a leaking roof that he patched with whatever scraps he could find, and a stone fireplace that Sarah had insisted on when they'd first built their dreams here. The empty pantry shelves bore witness to how far those dreams had fallen since her death 8 months ago. Joseph stood 6 feet tall with the weathered hands of a man who'd known both war and peace, his Cherokee heritage evident in his high cheekbones and dark eyes, while his Irish father's influence showed in his lighter skin and the way his hair caught auburn highlights in the sun. Around his neck, he wore Sarah's simple gold wedding band on a leather cord, the one valuable thing he refused to sell, no matter how desperate things became. Little Wolf, at 9 years old, carried himself with the serious bearing of a boy forced to grow up too quickly. His father's son in temperament, he tried to shoulder responsibilities far too heavy for his young frame, checking the chickens they no longer owned and splitting kindling with an axe nearly too big for his hands. Sky, 7 and dreamy like her mother had been, spent her days drawing pictures with charcoal on pieces of bark, creating images of the family they used to be, always with 4 figures, never 3. Baby Thomas, barely 20 months old, served as both blessing and burden. Born during the terrible snowstorm that took Sarah's life, he reminded Joe daily of what love could cost. The boy was sickly, prone to fevers and coughs that terrified his father, who had no money for doctors and no knowledge of the healing arts that might save him. The community's attitude toward the Crow Feather family had hardened since Sarah's death. She had been their bridge to acceptance, the white woman who had chosen love over social convention, who had attended church socials and befriended the other wives. Without her gentle diplomacy, the family became simply another reminder of uncomfortable truths about race and belonging that Cedar Falls preferred to ignore. Joe worked whatever jobs he could find, splitting logs, mending fences, harvesting crops for neighbors who paid him half what they'd pay a white man for the same work. The bank held notes on his land that he couldn't possibly repay, and whispers followed him through town about the half-breed widower who couldn't properly care for his children. The coffee tin that held their remaining money contained exactly 3 copper pennies and a prayer. Winter was coming to Montana, and Joe had never felt so alone in his life, watching his children grow thinner each day while he struggled against a world that seemed determined to break them all. The woman who dismounted from her horse in the pale moonlight moved with a confidence that spoke of education and means, yet her clothes were simple traveling garb, a worn brown dress and practical boots that had seen many miles. She appeared to be in her early 30s with dark hair braided back beneath a plain bonnet, and when she stepped into the circle of lamplight from Joe's window, her mixed heritage became apparent in features that could have belonged to either world. She moved between. "My name is Mary Standing Bear," she said, her voice carrying the crisp diction of formal schooling layered over something deeper, older. "I heard the baby crying from the road. I'm a traveling nurse." Joe's rifle remained half-raised, suspicion warring with desperate hope in his chest. Strangers didn't simply appear at his door in the middle of the night with offers of help. In his experience, midnight visitors brought foreclosure notices, eviction orders, or worse. Yet baby Thomas's cries had grown weaker over the past hour, and the fever that burned through his small body had Joe terrified beyond rational thought. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but," Joe began, but Mary was already moving past him toward the sound of the baby's distress. "That child is very sick," she said, not asking permission as she entered the cabin. "How long has he had the fever?" Something in her tone, professional, assured, completely unafraid, made Joe lower his weapon. He followed her inside, watching as she immediately went to the crude wooden cradle where Thomas lay fitfully, his tiny face flushed and damp with perspiration. Mary placed gentle hands on the baby's forehead and neck, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "His temperature is dangerously high. Do you have any willow bark, honey, clean cloth?" "I've got clean rags," Joe said helplessly. "Nothing else." Without another word, Mary went back outside and returned with a leather satchel that looked far too expensive for a traveling nurse's belongings. From it, she withdrew small glass vials, packets of dried herbs, and medical instruments that gleamed even in the dim lamplight. Joe noticed her hands, soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who had never known truly hard labor. "I need hot water," Mary said, already crushing leaves between her palms with movements that suggested deep familiarity with medicinal preparation. "And we need to bring his temperature down gradually." As Joe stoked the fire and set water to boil, he watched this stranger work over his son with a skill that made him wonder exactly what kind of traveling nurse carried such expensive supplies. She mixed a tincture that smelled of pine and something sweet, then carefully administered drops to the baby's mouth. "There," she murmured, her voice carrying a tenderness that made Joe's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "That should help, little one." Baby Thomas's cries gradually subsided into whimpers, then finally into the deeper breathing of natural sleep. The change was so dramatic that Joe found himself staring at Mary with something approaching awe. "How did you—" he started to ask, but movement from the other room interrupted him. Little Wolf appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, followed closely by Sky, who rubbed her eyes and peered curiously at the stranger tending their baby brother. Both children were painfully thin, their nightshirts hanging loose on frames that spoke of too many missed meals. "Papa?" Little Wolf asked, his voice carefully controlled in the way of children who had learned not to show fear. "Is Thomas—" "He's better, son," Joe said, surprised by the relief in his own voice. "This is Miss Standing Bear." "She's a nurse." Sky moved closer to Mary with the fearless curiosity of childhood, studying her with wide, dark eyes. "Are you going to stay and take care of us?" she asked with the directness that only children possessed. Mary's hands stilled for a moment on baby Thomas's blanket. When she looked up at Sky, something flickered across her face, an expression Joe couldn't quite read. I was just passing through," she said softly. "But perhaps I could stay for a day or two, just to make sure he continues to recover." The smell that had drawn Joe outside returned as Mary unwrapped the cloth bundle she'd brought. A loaf of bread still warm from baking, its crust golden and perfect. The aroma filled the small cabin with promises of sustenance and comfort that had been absent for too long. "I baked this earlier today," Mary said, as if reading the hunger in the children's eyes. "There's plenty to share." Little Wolf and Sky looked to their father with expressions of desperate hope barely contained. Joe's pride warred with his children's need, but when baby Thomas stirred peacefully in his cradle, the first natural sleep he'd had in days, the decision made itself. "We'd be grateful for your help, Miss Standing Bear," Joe said quietly, "and for the bread." As Mary began slicing the loaf with a knife from her satchel, Joe noticed she moved through his kitchen as if she belonged there, finding plates and cups with an ease that suggested deep familiarity with making homes out of humble spaces. Outside, her horse stood patiently in the yard, expensive tack glinting in the moonlight. Another detail that didn't quite fit the story of a simple traveling nurse. But baby Thomas was breathing easier. His children were about to eat their first good meal in days, and for the first time in months, Joe felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. 10 days passed like a dream Joe had forgotten he was capable of having. Mary Standing Bear settled into the rhythm of their household with an ease that both comforted and unsettled him. Each morning, she rose before dawn to tend the fire and prepare breakfast from supplies that seemed to replenish themselves mysteriously. Coffee beans appearing when the tin ran empty, salt pork materializing when their stores dwindled to nothing. Baby Thomas thrived under her care, his fever-bright eyes clearing to the healthy alertness of a child discovering the world anew. She sang to him in what Joe recognized as Lakota, her voice carrying lullabies that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Little Wolf, initially suspicious of any change to their careful survival routine, began seeking her approval for his small accomplishments: a successfully split log, a perfectly gathered handful of eggs from the neighbor's wandering chickens. But it was Sky who bloomed most dramatically under Mary's attention. The little girl, who had barely spoken since her mother's death, began chattering constantly about everything Mary taught her: how to identify healing plants, the proper way to preserve meat, the stories hidden in the patterns of stars. Mary had somehow produced a slate and chalk from her seemingly endless satchel, and Sky spent hours practicing letters with the concentration of a scholar. "Where did you learn to read?" Mary asked one afternoon as Sky carefully traced the word mother in Cherokee syllabary. "Mama taught me before she got sick," Sky replied, not looking up from her work. "But I forgot some after she went to be with the spirits." Joe, mending harness nearby, felt the familiar stab of guilt that accompanied any mention of Sarah's decline. Mary's eyes found his across the small room, and something in her expression suggested understanding of griefs too deep for casual comfort. It was during these quiet domestic moments that Joe began noticing the inconsistencies in Mary's story. Her medical knowledge extended far beyond what any frontier nurse should possess. She spoke casually of surgical procedures, quoted from medical texts he'd never heard of, and carried supplies that would have cost more than most families saw in a year. Her horse, which she'd claimed was borrowed, bore the kind of expensive tack that belonged to wealthy ranchers or government officials. More troubling were the moments when she forgot to maintain her careful speech patterns. Late at night, when she thought no one was listening, her voice carried the precise diction of Eastern finishing schools. She knew the proper settings for formal dinners, could identify the quality of silver with a glance, and once mentioned attending a concert in Denver before catching herself and changing the subject. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Mrs. Patterson, their nearest neighbor, arrived unannounced with a basket of mending and enough gossip to fuel a month of church socials. Joe was splitting wood when he heard her voice rise to the pitch that usually preceded the worst kind of community judgment. "Most improper situation I've ever seen, Mary Standing Bear, or whatever her real name might be." A decent woman doesn't travel alone without proper escort, and certainly doesn't set up housekeeping with a widowed man as if they were. Joe's axe bit deep into the stump as he fought the urge to march inside and defend Mary's honor. Through the open window he could hear Mary's response, calm and measured despite the obvious provocation. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand your concern for propriety, but I'm here in my capacity as a medical professional ensuring the welfare of a sick child." "Professional?" Mrs. Patterson's voice dripped skepticism. "What credentials do you carry? What institution trained you?" "No proper lady travels with such expensive belongings unless she's running from something or someone." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Joe to set down his axe and move closer to the window. When Mary finally spoke, her voice carried a weariness that made his chest tighten with protective instinct. "I have the credentials that matter most, Mrs. Patterson. I can ease suffering, heal the sick, and provide care for children who need it. If that threatens your sense of propriety, I suggest you examine your priorities." Mrs. Patterson's departure was marked by the kind of door slamming that promised swift spread of scandal throughout Cedar Falls. Joe found Mary standing at the kitchen table, her hands braced against the worn wood, her shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion. "She's not wrong, you know," Mary said without turning around. "My presence here is compromising your family's reputation." Joe moved to stand beside her, close enough to smell the lavender soap she used, another luxury that didn't fit her claimed circumstances. "My family's reputation was compromised the day I married a white woman and decided to raise mixed children on the frontier. Mrs. Patterson's opinion doesn't change what's right." Mary turned to face him then, and Joe saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You don't understand. There are things about me, about why I'm really here." Before she could finish, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them both. Through the window, Joe saw Sheriff Morrison dismounting from his horse with the deliberate movements of a man who had come on official business. Behind him rode two men Joe didn't recognize, well-dressed strangers whose presence immediately set every instinct on high alert. Morrison's knock, when it came, carried the authority of law and the promise of trouble. Joe opened the door to find the sheriff's familiar face wearing an expression of grim satisfaction that made his stomach drop. "Joe," Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat in mock courtesy, "I need to speak with the woman calling herself Mary Standing Bear. Got some questions about her background and intentions." Behind Morrison, one of the strangers stepped forward, a tall man in an expensive suit whose pale blue eyes swept the cabin's interior with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to appraising property and finding it wanting. "Miss Reichman," the stranger said, his voice carrying the flat tones of the eastern plains. "Your father has been very worried about you." The color drained from Mary's face so quickly that Joe instinctively stepped closer to her. In that moment, watching her world collapse behind carefully constructed defenses, he realized that whatever secrets Mary had been carrying were about to destroy the fragile happiness they'd built together. Little Wolf and Sky pressed close to their father's sides, sensing danger in the way children always could, while baby Thomas stirred restlessly in his cradle. The cabin that had felt like a home for 10 precious days suddenly felt like a trap closing around them all. The silence that followed the stranger's revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Mary, or Elizabeth Reichman, as the well-dressed man had called her, stood frozen beside the kitchen table, her face a mask of emotions Joe couldn't begin to decipher. The children sensed the shift in atmosphere immediately. Sky moved closer to her father while Little Wolf positioned himself protectively near baby Thomas's cradle. "Miss Reichman," Sheriff Morrison said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Joe's hands clench into fists. "This is Mr. Heinrich Reichman, your father, and Mr. James Caldwell, your intended husband. They've been searching for you for months. The older man, Heinrich Reichmann, stepped into the cabin without invitation, his expensive boots clicking against the rough wooden floor. Everything about him spoke of wealth and authority, from his perfectly tailored coat to the gold watch chain spanning his vest. His eyes swept the humble interior with undisguised disdain before settling on his daughter. "Elizabeth," he said, his German accent coloring the carefully modulated English, "this charade has gone on long enough. You will come home immediately." Mary's composure cracked then, and Joe saw the woman he'd come to care for disappear behind the frightened expression of a trapped daughter. "Father," she whispered, the single word carrying years of complicated history. The second stranger, Caldwell, moved forward with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. Younger than Reichmann, but no less imposing, he wore his wealth like armor and his authority like a weapon. "My dear Elizabeth," he said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Your little adventure is over. We have a wedding to plan." Joe's protective instincts flared to life. "Now wait just a minute," he said, stepping between the strangers and Mary. "Mary, Miss Standing Bear, is here of her own free will, helping care for my sick child." Morrison's hand moved to rest on his gun belt, a casual gesture that carried clear threat. "Joe, you need to step aside. This is a family matter, and you're interfering with the lawful recovery of Miss Reichmann." "Recovery?" Joe's voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm. "She's not stolen property. She's a grown woman who can make her own choices." Caldwell's laugh was cold enough to freeze summer rain. "Choices? She's my fiancée, promised to me by legal contract. Her father and I have significant business arrangements that depend on this union. Whatever attachment she may have formed here is irrelevant." The casual dismissal of their relationship, tenuous though it was, ignited something dangerous in Joe's chest. "Attachment? Mary has been caring for my children, saving my son's life. If you think you can just march in here and—" "Joseph!" Mary's voice cut through his growing anger like a blade. When he turned to look at her, he saw tears streaming down her face and something that looked like resignation settling over her features. "Please, don't make this harder than it has to be." Little Wolf, who had been watching the adults with the intense focus of a child trying to understand a world suddenly turned hostile, stepped forward. "Miss Mary," he said, his young voice steady despite the fear in his eyes, "are these bad men? Are they trying to take you away?" The question seemed to break something inside Mary. She knelt down to Little Wolf's level, gathering both him and Sky close to her. "Listen to me, both of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't want to do. But that doesn't mean the love stops, do you understand?" Sky began to cry, great silent tears that spoke of too much loss for such a small heart to bear. "But you're our mama now," she whispered. "You said you'd teach me to read all the words." The pain that crossed Mary's face was so raw that Joe had to look away. Heinrich Reichmann, however, seemed unmoved by his daughter's distress or the children's obvious attachment to her. "Enough of this sentimental nonsense," he said curtly. "Elizabeth, gather your belongings. We leave within the hour." Mary stood slowly, her hand lingering on Sky's hair. "Father, these children need medical attention. The baby was severely ill when I arrived, and the health of these people is not your concern," Caldwell interrupted, his tone making it clear exactly what he thought of Joe's mixed-race family. "Your concern is fulfilling your obligations to me and to your father's business interests." The casual cruelty of the dismissal finally pushed Joe past his breaking point. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "All of you. Mary is welcome to stay as long as she chooses, but I won't have my children insulted in their own home." Morrison's hand moved to his gun. "Joe, I warned you not to interfere. Miss Reichman is coming with us, and that's final. If you try to stop us, I'll have you arrested for kidnapping and corrupting a white woman." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Joe knew Morrison well enough to understand that the sheriff would make good on his promise, and that the territorial justice system was unlikely to side with a half-Cherokee widower against wealthy white citizens. The children seemed to sense the danger. Baby Thomas began fussing in his cradle while Skye pressed closer to Mary's side. Mary closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, Joe saw the woman he'd come to care for disappearing behind walls of resignation and defeated acceptance. "I'll get my things," she said quietly. "Mary, no," Joe said. But she was already moving toward the storage room where she'd been sleeping. The sound of her gathering her belongings felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to the end of everything good that had entered their lives. While Mary packed, Heinrich Reichmann moved around the cabin with the air of a man conducting an inventory. He picked up one of Skye's bark drawings, studying it with the same detached interest he might show a curiosity in a museum. "Primitive," he murmured to Caldwell. Elizabeth always had a tendency toward romanticizing the noble savage mythology. The casual racism might have prompted Joe to violence under other circumstances, but the presence of his children and Morrison's ready gun kept him in check. Instead, he focused on memorizing every detail of Mary's face as she emerged from the storage room with her leather satchel, trying to burn the image into his memory before she disappeared from their lives forever. Mary knelt once more beside the children, pressing a small, wrapped package into Skye's hands. "This is for you," she whispered. "The slate and chalk and something else. Promise me you'll keep practicing your letters." Skye nodded solemnly, clutching the package to her chest like a lifeline. Little Wolf stood straighter, trying to be brave, but Joe could see the tremor in his son's chin that betrayed his efforts not to cry. "Will you come back?" Little Wolf asked, the question every adult in the room knew had no good answer. Mary's composure finally cracked completely. She pulled both children into a fierce embrace, her tears falling freely now. "I love you both so much," she whispered. "Remember that, no matter what happens. Remember that you are worthy of love and protection and all the good things this world has to offer." Caldwell cleared his throat impatiently. "Elizabeth, we really must be going. The train to Denver leaves this evening and we have arrangements to make." Mary stood on unsteady legs, shouldering her satchel with the mechanical movements of someone forcing herself through necessary motions. She moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to Joe. For a moment their eyes met across the small room that had become a haven for both of them, and Joe saw years of words they would never have the chance to say. "Thank you," she said simply, "for letting me be part of your family even for a little while." Before Joe could respond, Morrison stepped forward. "Time to go, Miss Reichman. We've got a long ride ahead of us." As the group moved toward the door, Baby Thomas began crying. Not the fretful fussing of illness, but the deep, inconsolable wailing of a child who understood that safety was being taken away. Mary stopped so abruptly that Caldwell nearly walked into her. "The baby," she said, turning back toward the cradle. "He still needs—" "Elizabeth," Heinrich Reichmann's voice carried the tone of absolute authority, "you will not embarrass this family further by prolonging this unseemly attachment. Come, now." The finality in his voice seemed to break the last of Mary's resistance. She allowed Caldwell to take her arm and guide her toward the door. Though Joe noticed, she kept looking back at the children with an expression of such raw grief that it made his own chest ache in sympathy. As they reached the threshold, Skye broke free from her father's restraining hand and ran toward the departing group. "Mama, Mary," she cried, the words echoing across the yard like a prayer and a protest combined. Mary turned back one final time, and for a moment Joe thought she might refuse to leave, might choose their makeshift family over whatever obligations bound her to these cold strangers. But Heinrich Reichmann's hand closed firmly on her other arm, and the moment passed. "Goodbye," she whispered, the word barely audible above Sky's continued crying and baby Thomas's wails. Joe watched helplessly as the woman who had brought hope and healing into their lives was led away like a prisoner, her father and intended husband flanking her like guards escorting a dangerous criminal. Morrison mounted his horse with obvious satisfaction, having once again imposed what he considered proper order on Joe's chaotic existence. As the small procession rode away toward Cedar Falls in the train that would carry Mary back to her former life, Joe was left standing in his doorway with 3 heartbroken children and the devastating knowledge that sometimes love simply wasn't enough to overcome the barriers that society erected between people. The cabin felt impossibly empty without Mary's presence, as if something essential had been torn from its very foundations. Baby Thomas continued crying, reaching tiny hands toward the door through which his caretaker had disappeared, and Joe realized with crushing certainty that their brief taste of happiness was over before it had truly begun. The weeks following Mary's forced departure brought a winter of the soul that had nothing to do with Montana's brutal weather. Joe threw himself into desperate work, taking any job that would pay. Splitting firewood for neighbors who whispered behind his back, mucking stables for men who wouldn't meet his eyes, hauling freight through mountain passes that tested both his endurance and his will to survive. But no amount of physical labor could drive away the memory of Mary's tears or the children's bewildered questions about when their Mama Mary would return. Baby Thomas bore the separation hardest of all. Within days of Mary's departure, his appetite vanished, and the robust health she had carefully nurtured began deteriorating at an alarming rate. He cried inconsolably for hours, reaching small hands toward the door as if willing her to return through sheer need. Joe's attempts to comfort his youngest son felt clumsy and inadequate after watching Mary's natural grace with the children. The baby began refusing the cow's milk that had sustained him, and dark circles appeared under his eyes as he grew thinner and more listless each passing day. Sky retreated into a silence deeper than any she had maintained after her mother's death. She clutched the package Mary had given her, the slate, chalk, and what turned out to be a small leather-bound journal filled with Cherokee stories written in both English and syllabary, as if these items were sacred relics. She would sit for hours by the window, drawing pictures of the woman who had become her second mother, her small face wearing an expression of loss that was heartbreaking to witness in one so young. Little Wolf, true to his nature, attempted to fill the void Mary had left by taking on responsibilities far beyond his years. He tried to cook meals with disastrous results, attempted to soothe baby Thomas with songs he half remembered Mary singing, and hovered protectively around his siblings, as if his vigilance alone could prevent further loss. His efforts were touching but ultimately futile. A 9-year-old boy, no matter how determined, could not replace the warmth and competence Mary had brought to their household. The community's reaction to Mary's departure revealed the full extent of their isolation. Mrs. Patterson spread word throughout Cedar Falls that the dangerous influence had been removed from the Crowfeather household, and several church ladies took credit for alerting Sheriff Morrison to the improper situation. The righteous satisfaction in their voices when they discussed Mary's forced return to proper society made Joe's hands clench into fists whenever he overheard their conversations in town. But it was Morrison himself who delivered the cruelest blow. 2 weeks after Mary's departure, the sheriff arrived at Joe's cabin with a collection of legal documents that would haunt Joe's nightmares for months to come. The papers bore official seals and formal language that barely disguised their devastating content. Accusations of immoral conduct, endangering the welfare of minor children, and violation of territorial statutes regarding proper guardianship. "You brought this on yourself, Joe," Morrison said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that revealed how long he had been planning this moment. "Having an unmarried woman living in your house, exposing your children to improper influences, the territorial court has determined that your household is an unfit environment for raising children." The words hit Joe like physical blows. He stared at the documents, trying to process their implications while his children played innocently in the next room. "What are you saying, Morrison?" "I'm saying the children will be placed in proper care while you undergo evaluation. Little Wolf and Sky will be sent to the territorial boarding school in Helena, where they can receive Christian education and learn to integrate properly into civilized society. The baby will be placed with a suitable white family for adoption." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Joe's feet. "You can't do this. These are my children. I've done nothing wrong." Morrison's smile was cold enough to freeze hell itself. "Haven't you? You allowed an unmarried woman of questionable character to live in your home, exposing innocent children to moral corruption. Miss Reichman herself has provided testimony about the inappropriate conditions she witnessed here." The betrayal hit Joe harder than any physical blow could have. Mary had testified against him. The woman who had sung lullabies to his children, who had saved baby Thomas's life, who had brought laughter back into their home, she had condemned them all to satisfy her father's demands. "I don't believe you," Joe said, but his voice lacked conviction. The legal documents in his hands bore official seals that were impossible to fake, and Morrison's confidence suggested he held all the winning cards in this cruel game. "Transportation will arrive tomorrow morning," Morrison continued, oblivious to or uncaring about Joe's anguish. "The children should be packed and ready. Any resistance will result in your arrest and additional charges." That night, Joe sat alone at his kitchen table after putting the children to bed, staring at the legal papers that would tear his family apart. The cabin felt enormous in its emptiness, every corner holding memories of Mary's brief but transformative presence. Her bread recipes still lay scattered on the kitchen counter where she had left them, and the scent of her lavender soap seemed to linger in the air like a ghost of happier times. He tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Mary's arrival had seemed like a miracle, an answer to desperate prayers he had barely dared to voice. She had brought healing to his sick child, hope to his grieving daughter, confidence to his troubled son, and something dangerously close to love to his own wounded heart. How had that blessing transformed into this nightmare of legal accusations and forced separations? The sound of Sky crying softly in the next room drew him from his dark thoughts. He found her sitting up in bed, clutching Mary's journal to her chest, while tears streamed down her small face. "Papa," she whispered, "did we do something bad? Is that why Mama Mary had to go away?" Joe's heart shattered completely at the innocent question. He gathered his daughter into his arms, feeling the fragile weight of her trust and knowing he was about to fail her in ways that would scar her for life. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice breaking. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes things happen that aren't fair." "Will we see her again?" Sky asked, her voice small and desperate for reassurance he couldn't provide. Joe held her tighter, unable to voice the lies that might comfort her temporarily. The truth was too terrible to speak aloud. By tomorrow evening, his children would be gone, scattered to institutions and adoptive families where Mary's name would become a forbidden memory. Whatever future awaited them would unfold without him, and the family she had helped him rebuild would exist only in the increasingly painful realm of what might have been. As dawn approached, Joe made the hardest decision of his life. Rather than subject his children to the trauma of forced separation, he would flee with them into the wilderness. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success. Winter was approaching. They had no supplies for extended travel, and Morrison would pursue them relentlessly. But the alternative, watching his children disappear into a system designed to erase their heritage and their connection to him, was unthinkable. He spent the pre-dawn hours gathering what few supplies he could carry, packing warm clothes for the children and the small amount of food remaining in their stores. Baby Thomas stirred restlessly in his sleep, and Joe realized with crushing despair that the journey would likely kill his weakest child. But staying meant losing all three of them forever, and at least in the wilderness they would remain together until the end. As the first light of morning touched the Montana sky, Joe heard the distant sound of approaching wagons, Morrison and his men, coming to collect their human cargo. There was no more time for hesitation or second thoughts. He woke Little Wolf and Sky, whispering urgent instructions about the need for absolute silence, and gathered baby Thomas into his arms. They slipped out the back of the cabin just as the official convoy reached the front yard, Joe carrying his youngest son, while Little Wolf and Sky followed like shadows through the early morning mist. Behind them, their home, the place where Mary had brought such brief happiness, stood empty and waiting for the authorities who would find nothing but abandoned dreams and broken promises. The wilderness ahead offered only hardship and uncertainty, but it also held the possibility of remaining together as a family. As they disappeared into the pine forests that bordered their former life, Joe carried with him the memory of Mary's love for his children and the desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, they might find their way back to each other. The mountain wilderness, that had seemed like salvation in the desperate moments of their escape, quickly revealed itself as a crucible designed to test every limit of human endurance. For 3 weeks, Joe and his children moved through the pine forests and rocky canyons of the Montana Territory like hunted animals, always listening for the sound of pursuit, always pushing forward despite exhaustion that threatened to consume them all. Baby Thomas, already weakened by Mary's absence and his refusal to eat properly, grew thinner and more listless with each passing day. The cow's milk Joe had brought in a small jug had soured within days, and the baby's tiny system couldn't tolerate the stream water and thin gruel that sustained the rest of them. His cries grew weaker and more infrequent, a change that terrified Joe more than the loudest wailing ever could have. Sky, once eager to explore and learn, stumbled through their daily marches in a daze of confusion and grief that broke Joe's heart to witness. She clutched Mary's journal constantly, even when the practical demands of survival required both hands free for climbing or balance. At night, she would whisper stories to herself in Cherokee, the words Mary had taught her becoming a lifeline to hope in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything she loved. Little Wolf, who had tried so hard to be the man of the family, finally succumbed to the weight of responsibilities no child should carry. On their 15th day in the wilderness, when a sudden snowstorm caught them without adequate shelter, he broke down completely, sobbing with the raw desperation of a 9-year-old boy who had watched his world collapse around him and couldn't understand why. "Papa, I can't do this anymore," he cried, his small body shaking with more than just cold as they huddled together in a shallow cave. "I want Mama Mary. I want to go home. Why did the bad men take her away from us?" Joe had no answers that could comfort his son, no explanations that could make sense of the cruelty they had endured. He could only hold his children closer and pray to whatever spirits might be listening that they would find the strength to survive one more day, one more night, one more step forward into an uncertain future. The worst moment came on their 18th day in the wilderness, when baby Thomas stopped crying altogether. Joe woke that morning to find his youngest son burning with fever yet again, But this time there was no Mary to work miracles with herbs and gentle hands. The baby's breathing was shallow and labored, his tiny face flushed with a heat that spoke of infection, or worse. Skye noticed immediately when her baby brother's condition deteriorated. "Papa," she whispered, her voice carrying a maturity no 7-year-old should possess, "Thomas needs Mama Mary's medicine." He needs her to sing the healing songs. The simple truth of his daughter's words hit Joe like a physical blow. Mary's medical knowledge, her expensive supplies, her intuitive understanding of what each child needed, all of it was lost to them now, probably forever. Baby Thomas might die in his arms while the woman who could save him lived in comfort hundreds of miles away, preparing for a marriage that would make her forget they had ever existed. That night, as Joe kept vigil over his critically ill son, he made a decision that felt like admitting defeat. They couldn't survive much longer in the wilderness, especially not with Thomas so sick and winter approaching with deadly certainty. If they were going to lose their battle for freedom, at least they could surrender on terms that might save the children's lives. As dawn broke over their makeshift camp, Joe began the heartbreaking task of preparing his children for separation. He explained as gently as he could that they would have to return to civilization, that staying together was no longer possible if they wanted baby Thomas to survive. "Will they really take us away from you, Papa?" Skye asked, her dark eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from understanding too much about adult cruelties. Joe couldn't lie to her, not when she had already endured so much disappointment and betrayal. "Yes, sweetheart, they probably will. But you'll have each other, and you'll remember everything Mama Mary taught you about being strong and brave and kind." Little Wolf, who had been listening with the intense concentration of a child trying to process impossible choices, suddenly straightened his shoulders. "If we have to go, Papa, will you promise to find Mama Mary? Will you tell her we still love her?" The question pierced Joe's heart with its innocent assumption that Mary's departure had been beyond her control, that she might still care enough about them to want messages of love from the children she had abandoned. Part of him wanted to preserve their faith in her, but another part burned with the betrayal of her testimony against him. "I'll try, son," he said, the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. "I'll try." The journey back to civilization took 4 days of careful movement, with Joe scouting ahead to avoid Morrison's patrols while the children followed at a distance. Baby Thomas's condition stabilized slightly in the warmer temperatures of the lower elevations, but Joe knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Without proper medical care, his youngest son wouldn't survive much longer. They emerged from the wilderness on a gray November morning that felt like the end of everything Joe had ever hoped for. Cedar Falls looked exactly the same as it had a month ago, but Joe felt like a different man, hollowed out by loss and failure, aged decades by the weight of decisions that had saved nothing and cost everything. Mrs. Patterson was hanging laundry when she spotted them approaching along the main road. Her scream of recognition brought neighbors running, and within minutes, Sheriff Morrison was galloping toward them with a posse of men who looked eager to prove their civic virtue by apprehending dangerous fugitives. "Joseph Crow Feather," Morrison called out as he reined in his horse, "you're under arrest for violation of court orders, endangering the welfare of minor children, and evading lawful custody. Those children will be taken into protective custody immediately." Joe made no attempt to resist as the men dismounted and approached with drawn weapons. He was beyond fighting now, beyond hope or anger or anything except the numb acceptance of inevitable defeat. The children clustered around him, clinging to his legs and arms as if their touch could somehow prevent the final separation they all knew was coming. "Papa," Skye whispered, tears streaming down her face as strange hands began pulling her away from his side. "Don't forget to find Mama Mary. Don't forget to tell her we love her." Little Wolf fought harder, struggling against the men who lifted him away from his father with the desperate strength of a child who understood that this moment marked the end of his childhood, the end of his family, the end of everything that had ever made him feel safe in the world. Baby Thomas, too weak to protest, simply stared at Joe with dark eyes that seemed to hold accusations and forgiveness in equal measure. As the men carried him toward the wagon that would take him to his new life with strangers, Joe saw Mary's face in his son's features and wondered if she would even remember the baby she had saved when she heard of his death. The last thing Joe saw before Morrison's men dragged him away to jail was Sky's small hand waving goodbye from the back of the departing wagon, still clutching Mary's journal like a talisman against the darkness that was swallowing their world. In that moment, he understood that losing his children was a death sentence far more final than anything the territorial courts could impose, and that Mary's betrayal had cut deeper than any knife ever could. The cabin they had briefly called home stood empty on the horizon, its windows dark and cold, waiting for new occupants who would never know that for a few precious weeks it had sheltered a love deep enough to challenge the cruel certainties of an unforgiving world. The Denver mansion that served as Elizabeth Reichman's prison was a monument to wealth and respectability, its marble floors and crystal chandeliers reflecting a world as cold and sterile as the winter wind that rattled its expensive windows. For 3 weeks, Mary had moved through its opulent rooms like a ghost, going through the motions of wedding preparations, while her heart remained in a humble Montana cabin with 3 children who had called her Mama. Heinrich Reichmann's study served as the command center for his vast mining empire, its walls lined with maps marking Cherokee territories, geological surveys, and legal documents that bore the signatures of corrupt officials. Mary had discovered the full scope of her father's operations within days of her forced return, a systematic campaign to drive native families from their lands through legal manipulation, economic pressure, and, when necessary, violence disguised as law enforcement. The wedding dress that hung in her room was a masterpiece of European craftsmanship, its silk and lace worth more than most families saw in a lifetime. But every time Mary looked at it, she saw Sky's tear-stained face and heard baby Thomas's weakening cries. James Caldwell visited daily, bringing gifts that felt like shackles, and speaking of their future together with the casual confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. "The ceremony will be Christmas Eve," Caldwell announced during one of his visits, settling into the leather chair across from Mary's window seat as if he belonged there. "Your father has invited several territorial officials, including the judges who will be ruling on various land disputes next spring. A very strategic guest list." Mary continued staring out at the Denver streets, where snow was beginning to fall in patterns that reminded her of the Montana wilderness where Joe and his children might be hiding. "How convenient," she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth that had once filled a cabin with laughter. "Business and pleasure combined." Caldwell's eyes narrowed at her tone. "Elizabeth, this sullen behavior has gone on long enough. You're going to be my wife in less than a month, and I expect you to start acting like it. Whatever infatuation you developed for that half-breed and his mongrel children needs to end." The casual cruelty of his words sparked the first real emotion Mary had felt since leaving Montana. She turned from the window to face him directly, her green eyes blazing with a fury that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Don't you ever speak of them that way again," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Those children have more honor and worth than you'll ever possess." Caldwell's face flushed with anger and wounded pride. "Those children are exactly what's wrong with this territory. Mixed breeds who don't know their place, being raised by a man too ignorant to civilize them properly. You should be grateful we removed you from that situation before it corrupted you further." Mary stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Corrupted me? James, spending time with that family was the first pure, honest thing I'd experienced in my entire life. Joe Crowfeather is twice the man you'll ever be, and his children? His children are now wards of the state, Caldwell interrupted with obvious satisfaction. Separated and placed in proper institutions where they can learn to contribute to civilized society instead of living like savages in the wilderness. The words hit Mary like physical blows. "What are you talking about?" Caldwell's smile was cold and triumphant. "Did you think there wouldn't be consequences for your little adventure? Your testimony about the inappropriate conditions in that household gave the territorial court everything they needed to remove those children from their father's custody. The older ones are in boarding school, being taught proper Christian values. The baby was adopted by a suitable white family." Mary's legs gave out, and she collapsed back onto the window seat as the full implications of what Caldwell was saying crashed over her. "My testimony? I never testified against Joe. I never—" "Didn't you?" Caldwell produced a document from his coat pocket, unfolding it with theatrical precision. "Your signature is right here, attesting to the immoral conditions, the lack of proper supervision, the inappropriate influence that half-breed was having on innocent children." Mary snatched the paper from his hands, her eyes scanning the formal language that described Joe's household in terms that made her stomach turn. The signature at the bottom was indeed hers, but she had never seen this document before, had never agreed to any of the devastating accusations it contained. "This is forged," she whispered. But even as she said it, she recognized the letterhead, remembered signing blank papers that her father had claimed were routine legal documents related to her inheritance. "You used my signature to destroy them." Caldwell's expression showed no remorse whatsoever. "We used the resources at our disposal to rectify a dangerous situation. Those children are better off without that man's influence, and you're better off without the romantic delusions he encouraged." Rage, unlike anything Mary had ever experienced, began building in her chest, a fury so pure and consuming that it burned away months of resigned despair and left only crystalline clarity in its wake. Her father and Caldwell hadn't just kidnapped her from the life she had chosen. They had systematically destroyed the family she had come to love, using her own name as a weapon against innocent children. That night, alone in her room with the wedding dress hanging like a specter in the corner, Mary began planning her escape with the methodical precision of a military campaign. She had discovered during her weeks of captivity that her father's security was designed to keep intruders out, not to keep a determined woman in. More importantly, she had realized that her forced cooperation was the only thing standing between Joe's family and complete destruction. The leather-bound journal she had kept hidden in her belongings contained more than Cherokee stories and language lessons. It held copies of documents she had photographed using her father's own equipment, proof of the systematic corruption that had driven dozens of families from their lands. The mining operation that Heinrich Reichmann was so eager to protect had been built on fraud, violence, and the systematic exploitation of legal loopholes designed to dispossess native peoples of their ancestral territories. But Mary's most valuable asset wasn't information. It was the inheritance that would legally become hers the moment she married Caldwell. Millions of dollars that her grandfather had accumulated through legitimate business dealings, money that Heinrich Reichmann had been using to fund his illegal operations without actually owning. Once Mary gained control of those funds, she could hire the best lawyers in the territory, buy the kind of justice that money could purchase, and fight the system that had destroyed Joe's family. The revelation that changed everything came 3 days before the scheduled wedding, when Mary overheard a conversation between her father and Sheriff Morrison in the study below her room. Morrison had ridden to Denver to collect his payment for services rendered, and his report painted a picture that made Mary's blood run cold. The half-breed and his brats tried to run for the wilderness, Morrison was saying, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator describing a successful hunt. Found them 3 weeks later, half-starved and beaten. The man's in territorial prison now, probably won't last the winter. The children were properly distributed. Boys to the boarding school in Helena. Baby died of fever before we could get him placed. Mary's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a scream of anguish. Baby Thomas, sweet, vulnerable baby Thomas, who had recovered so beautifully under her care, was dead. The child she had sung to sleep, had fed from her own hands, had watched take his first steps, was gone forever because of her father's greed and Caldwell's ambition. What about the investigation into our operations? Heinrich Reichmann's voice was carefully controlled, but Mary could hear the underlying tension. Morrison's laugh was harsh and confident. What investigation? With Crow Feather in prison and his children scattered, there's nobody left to make accusations. The territorial judges are all in our pocket, and any documentation that might have existed burned up in that convenient cabin fire last week. The casual mention of destroying her temporary home, the place where she had experienced the closest thing to real happiness she had ever known, broke the last of Mary's emotional restraints. She pressed her face against the cold window glass and wept for baby Thomas, for Joe rotting in prison, for little Wolf and Sky lost in an institutional system designed to erase their heritage and their memories of love. But beneath the grief, something harder and more dangerous was crystallizing. Her father and Caldwell had underestimated her completely, viewing her as a useful pawn rather than a woman capable of strategic thinking and decisive action. They had given her access to their plans, their methods, their weaknesses, assuming that her compliance was guaranteed by helplessness and feminine submission to male authority. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. The next morning, Mary began implementing a plan that would either destroy her father's empire and free Joe from prison, or get her killed in the attempt. She started by writing a series of letters to newspaper editors in territorial capitals, to federal marshals with reputations for honesty, to Cherokee tribal leaders who had the legal standing to challenge fraudulent land seizures in federal court. Each letter contained carefully documented evidence of her father's corruption, detailed descriptions of Morrison's illegal activities, and most importantly, a complete repudiation of the testimony that had been used to destroy Joe's family. She acknowledged her real identity, explained the circumstances of her coerced cooperation, and provided enough evidence to launch federal investigations that even Heinrich Reichmann's wealth couldn't suppress. But Mary's most audacious move was yet to come. On Christmas Eve morning, as guests began arriving for what they believed would be a lavish wedding ceremony, Mary Reichmann would instead deliver the performance of her lifetime, a public exposure that would bring down one of the territory's most powerful criminal enterprises and hopefully, if she had planned carefully enough, set Joe Crow Feather free to reclaim what remained of his shattered family. The wedding dress hanging in her room would serve as her costume for one final deception, but the vows she spoke would be to justice rather than to the man who had helped destroy everything she had ever loved. Christmas Eve morning dawned crisp and clear in Denver, with snow covering the city like a blanket of false innocence. The Reichmann mansion buzzed with activity as servants prepared for what society expected to be the wedding of the season. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across polished marble floors, while elaborate floral arrangements filled every room with the scent of hothouse roses that had cost more than most families' annual income. Mary stood before her bedroom mirror, wearing the silk and lace wedding dress that felt like a shroud. But hidden beneath the expensive fabric, sewn into the bodice where no one would think to look, were copies of every incriminating document she had gathered during her captivity. Today's performance would be her masterpiece, a public exposure that would destroy her father's empire and hopefully free the man she had come to love. The arriving guests represented the cream of territorial society, Judges, politicians, mining executives, and territorial officials whose corruption had enabled Heinrich Reichmann's systematic theft of Cherokee lands. Mary watched from her window as carriages deposited Denver's most powerful citizens at her father's door, each one unaware that they were attending their own funeral rather than a wedding. Among the last to arrive was Sheriff Morrison himself, resplendent in his best uniform and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had eliminated all threats to his profitable arrangement with the Reichmanns. Mary's hands clenched into fists when she saw him, remembering his casual announcement that baby Thomas had died of fever, that Joe was rotting in territorial prison, that little Wolf and Sky had been scattered to institutions designed to erase their heritage. A soft knock interrupted her dark thoughts. "Miss Elizabeth," called her personal maid, "your father requests your presence. The ceremony is about to begin." Mary took one final look at herself in the mirror, seeing not the obedient daughter Heinrich Reichmann expected, but a woman transformed by love and loss into something far more dangerous than he could imagine. "Tell my father I'll be down momentarily," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. The mansion's grand staircase had been decorated with white silk ribbons and winter roses, creating a picture of perfection that magazines would undoubtedly feature in their society pages. Mary descended slowly, aware that every eye in the assembled crowd was upon her, calculating her worth in terms of business connections and political advantages, rather than human qualities like kindness or courage. Heinrich Reichmann waited at the bottom of the stairs, his expression one of satisfaction barely contained. Beside him stood James Caldwell, handsome in his formal attire and radiating the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, the territorial judge who would perform the ceremony, a man whose mortgage on his own home was held by Reichmann's bank, smiled benevolently at what he assumed would be a routine joining of wealth to wealth. "My dear Elizabeth," Heinrich said as Mary reached the bottom of the stairs, "you look absolutely radiant. I trust you're ready to begin your new life as Mrs. Caldwell?" Mary smiled, the expression feeling like breaking glass on her face. "Oh, Father, I'm more ready than you could possibly imagine." The ceremony began with traditional words about love and commitment that felt like mockery in this context. Mary went through the motions of the ritual while mentally preparing for the moment when she would shatter the carefully constructed illusion her father had built around his criminal enterprise. When the judge reached the traditional question about objections to the union, Mary stepped forward slightly and spoke in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the crowded room. "Actually, Your Honor, I have several objections to voice." A ripple of confusion passed through the assembled guests. Heinrich Reichmann's face flushed with anger, while Caldwell moved as if to silence her. But Mary had positioned herself strategically beyond their immediate reach and in full view of the territorial officials whose presence gave her temporary protection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mary continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "before I pledge my life to Mr. Caldwell, I feel obligated to share some information about the business practices that will fund our married life." She reached into her bodice and withdrew the first of her hidden documents, a copy of a contract showing illegal payments to territorial judges in exchange for favorable rulings on Cherokee land disputes. "This is a contract bearing my father's signature, authorizing payments to Judge Harrison here for services that go far beyond his official duties." Judge Harrison's face went white as his name was spoken aloud in connection with corruption. Several guests moved closer to examine the document Mary held, while others began murmuring among themselves with the nervous energy of people realizing they might be witnessing a scandal of enormous proportions. Heinrich Reichmann finally found his voice. "Elizabeth, you're clearly suffering from some form of nervous breakdown. Guards, please escort my daughter to her room where she can receive proper medical attention." But Mary was ready for his attempt to silence her. "Actually, Father, I'm suffering from perfect clarity for the first time in my life." She produced another document, this one showing Morrison's payments for eliminating troublesome elements from mining territories. "Sheriff Morrison, perhaps you'd like to explain to these distinguished guests why you've been accepting money to drive Cherokee families from their legally owned lands?" Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but the presence of so many witnesses stayed his hand. "That's a forgery," he said. But his voice lacked conviction, and several of the territorial officials were already examining the evidence with expressions of growing alarm. Mary felt the momentum building in her favor and pressed her advantage. "I have documentation proving systematic fraud in land acquisitions, illegal mining operations on Cherokee territory, and the murder of at least 3 tribal leaders who opposed these activities." She produced a thick packet of papers, spreading them across the altar like a fan of accusations. "Every signature, every payment, every death, all documented and verified." The crowd's murmur rose to an uproar as guests realized they were witnessing the exposure of one of the territory's most powerful criminal enterprises. Several of the judges and politicians began edging toward the exits, clearly calculating their own exposure and planning their escapes. But Mary wasn't finished. "Most importantly," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "I want everyone here to know that my forced testimony against Joseph Crow Feather was obtained through fraud and coercion. My signature was forged on documents I never saw, and a good man is rotting in territorial prison for crimes he never committed, while his children have been scattered to institutions based on lies." Caldwell finally found his voice, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "Enough of this nonsense. You're obviously having some sort of breakdown. The wedding will continue as planned." Mary turned to face him directly, her green eyes blazing with the fury of a woman who had lost everything she held dear. "James, the only thing breaking down here is the fiction that you and my father are respectable businessmen instead of common criminals who hide behind legal documents and corrupt officials." The revelation that sent shockwaves through the entire assembly came when Mary produced her final piece of evidence, a letter from Morrison to Heinrich Reichmann discussing the convenient death of Sarah Crow Feather and plans to eliminate her husband if he became too troublesome. "Sheriff Morrison didn't just take money to drive families from their lands," Mary announced. "He murdered Joe's first wife to prevent her from exposing these operations." Morrison's nerve finally broke completely. He drew his gun with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, but Federal Marshal Thompson, one of the few honest lawmen in the territory, was faster. The sound of gunshots echoed through the mansion's marble halls as Morrison fell, his corruption finally catching up with him in the most final way possible. In the chaos that followed, Heinrich Reichmann was arrested along with 3 judges and several other officials. Caldwell, facing charges as an accessory to multiple crimes, attempted to flee but was apprehended before he could reach his carriage. The wedding that was supposed to cement a criminal empire instead became its spectacular downfall. Mary stood in the wreckage of her father's grand plans, still wearing her wedding dress but feeling truly free for the first time in her life. The inheritance that would have funded continued crimes was now hers to control, and she knew exactly what she intended to do with it. "Marshal Thompson," she said, approaching the federal officer who had restored order to the chaos, "I need your help securing the immediate release of Joseph Crow Feather from territorial prison. I also need to locate his children and begin the process of reuniting their family." Thompson nodded, his expression grave but respectful. "Ma'am, based on what you've revealed here today, I'd say Mr. Crow Feather is probably the least guilty man in this entire territory. We'll have him released and cleared of all charges within the week." As Mary began planning her return to Montana, she thought of Little Wolf and Sky, wherever they were. and hoped they would remember the Cherokee stories she had taught them. She thought of baby Thomas, whose death would haunt her forever, and of Joe, who had shown her what real love looked like in the brief weeks they had shared. The bread she had carried to his cabin seemed like a lifetime ago, but the love that had grown from that simple gesture remained as strong as ever. Now she had the resources to fight for justice, to rebuild what had been destroyed, and perhaps, if Joe could forgive her for the pain her family had caused, to create something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Christmas Eve had brought not a wedding, but a reckoning that would echo across the territory for years to come. 6 months after the Christmas Eve reckoning that had shattered Heinrich Reichmann's criminal empire, spring came to Montana with the promise of renewal that only those who had survived the harshest winters could truly appreciate. The territorial prison in Helena released Joseph Crow Feather on a Tuesday morning in April, his freedom secured by federal marshals who had spent weeks unraveling the web of corruption that had destroyed his family. Mary Standing Bear, she had legally reclaimed her chosen name, waited for him at the prison gates, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror at the prospect of seeing the man whose love had transformed her from a frightened heiress into a woman capable of bringing down empires. Joe emerged from the gray stone building looking older than his years, his Cherokee heritage evident in the dignity with which he carried himself despite months of unjust imprisonment. His dark eyes searched the small crowd of waiting people until they found Mary's face, and for a moment neither of them moved, separated by invisible barriers of pain and uncertainty that seemed as insurmountable as the prison walls he had just left behind. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared to cross first. Mary had rehearsed this moment countless times during her journey from Denver, had planned exactly what she would say to explain her father's crimes and her own unwilling part in the destruction of his family. But now, faced with the reality of Joe's quiet suffering and the knowledge that baby Thomas would never run to greet her again, all her carefully prepared words crumbled into ash. "Joe," she whispered, his name carrying the weight of months of guilt and longing. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the new lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. "Mary," he said simply. And in that single word she heard neither accusation nor forgiveness, just a weariness that spoke of losses too deep for easy healing. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face despite her determination to be strong. "About Thomas. About everything that happened because of my family's greed. I know sorry isn't enough. I know it can't bring him back or undo the pain you've suffered, but—" Joe's weathered hand touched her cheek, stopping her flood of words with infinite gentleness. "I know you didn't choose any of this," he said quietly. "I read the newspaper accounts of what happened in Denver. I know you risked everything to set things right." The forgiveness in his voice broke something open in Mary's chest, releasing months of guilt and self-recrimination in a torrent of tears. Joe pulled her into his arms, and for a moment they stood together in the shadow of the prison that had kept them apart, holding each other with the desperate intensity of people who had learned the true cost of love and separation. "Little Wolf and Sky," Mary said when she could speak again. "I've been working with federal agents to locate them. The boarding school records were deliberately falsified, but we're making progress. I won't stop until we find them and bring them home." Joe's arms tightened around her. "Are they—" "They're alive," Mary assured him quickly. "Separated, placed in different institutions, but alive, and according to the reports I've seen, they've maintained their spirits despite everything. Sky has been teaching other children the Cherokee stories I shared with her, and Little Wolf has been protecting younger boys from the worst of the institutional abuse." The pride that flickered across Joe's face was immediately shadowed by pain as he thought of his children enduring hardships that should never have been their burden to bear. "How long?" he asked. The legal process could take months, even with federal support, Mary admitted. But I've hired the best lawyers money can buy, and we have public opinion on our side now. The newspaper coverage of your case has created sympathy for families like yours throughout the territory. As they walked away from the prison together, Mary explained the plans she had been developing during Joe's incarceration. Her inheritance, now legally under her control, would fund a network of schools serving both Cherokee and white children, medical clinics providing free care to reservation families, and legal aid societies protecting Native rights throughout the Montana Territory. The money that had been accumulated through exploitation would be transformed into tools for justice and healing. "I want to do something else, too," Mary said, as they reached the hotel where she had been staying during her efforts to secure Joe's release. "I want to rebuild the cabin, make it bigger, better. A real home where our family can heal together when we find the children." Joe stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Our family?" The question hung between them, carrying all the uncertainty and hope that had sustained Mary through the darkest months of separation. "If you'll have me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I come with terrible baggage. I know my family caused unspeakable pain. But I love you, and I love Little Wolf and Sky, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what was taken from you." Joe's answer came not in words, but in actions, as he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with all the love and longing that months of separation had only intensified. When they finally broke apart, both were crying openly, no longer caring who might witness their emotions. "Yes," Joe said simply. "Yes to all of it. To rebuilding, to healing, to making a family together that honors Thomas's memory and gives Little Wolf and Sky the love they deserve." The next several months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, construction projects, and the painstaking work of tracking down children who had been deliberately scattered across the territorial system. Mary's wealth opened doors and loosened tongues, while Joe's knowledge of Cherokee customs and his growing reputation as a symbol of justice provided moral authority that money alone couldn't buy. They found Little Wolf first, in a boarding school near the Canadian border where he had been listed under a false name and forbidden to speak Cherokee or maintain any connection to his heritage. At 11 years old, he had grown tall and serious, his father's dignity evident in the way he carried himself, despite the institutional attempts to break his spirit. When Joe and Mary walked into the school's austere visiting room, Little Wolf's composure cracked completely, and he ran to his father with tears streaming down his face. "Papa," he sobbed, clinging to Joe with desperate intensity, "I knew you'd come. I told the other boys you'd come for us." Sky was discovered 3 weeks later in a church-run orphanage in Wyoming, where she had been placed under the name Sarah White in a deliberate attempt to erase her Cherokee identity. But she had never forgotten the stories Mary had taught her, and she had been secretly teaching them to other children using the Cherokee syllabary she remembered from Mary's journal. When the matron led her into the room where Joe and Mary waited, she looked between them with eyes that held too much wisdom for an 8-year-old child. "Mama Mary," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, "you came back. You remembered us." The reunion was everything Mary had dreamed of and more painful than she had imagined, as she was forced to confront the evidence of what her family's actions had cost these precious children. But there was healing, too, in the way Sky still trusted her with absolute faith, in the way Little Wolf gradually relaxed his protective vigilance as he realized his family was truly being restored. The new cabin they built together was larger than the original, with separate bedrooms for each child and a kitchen big enough for the cooking lessons Mary resumed with Sky. But the heart of the home remained the same wooden table where they shared meals and stories, where homework was completed and dreams were discussed, where the daily ritual of breaking bread together became a sacrament of love and belonging. On the first anniversary of baby Thomas's death, they planted a garden in his memory, filled with the medicinal herbs Mary had used to heal him and the wildflowers that had bloomed around their original cabin. It became a place of peace and remembrance where they could honor their lost child while celebrating the family that had survived and grown stronger through their trials. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Joe and Mary were finally married in a ceremony that blended Cherokee traditions with Christian elements, witnessed by a community that had learned to see past surface differences to the deeper truths of love and commitment. Little Wolf and Sky served as witnesses, their faces glowing with the happiness of children who had found their way home against impossible odds. That night, as they tucked their children into beds in a house that truly belonged to them all, Mary reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of quiet joy. A simple loaf of bread had been the beginning, but love had been the force that transformed individual lives into a family capable of surviving any storm. Dear friends, have you ever experienced a moment when a small act of kindness completely changed your life's direction? This story reminds us that even in our golden years, we can still find unexpected love, create new families, and build meaningful connections that transcend traditional boundaries. Sometimes our greatest happiness comes not from what we planned, but from opening our hearts to possibilities we never imagined. The courage to love again, to fight for what's right, and to believe in second chances. These aren't just young person's dreams, they're the wisdom of a life fully lived. What unexpected blessing has walked into your life when you needed it most? Have you ever had to choose between security and love? And which did you choose? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of resilience and hope might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.